their planning for Trump is basically to come up with a list of important issue sets that will be completely destabilized by Trump being reelected, from Ukraine to NATO to climate change to tariffs, and then figuring out how to respond. And the problem is that just nobody knows. Like you said, every option is kind of bad if you're one of these European elected officials or diplomats.
All right, we are back with my old tormentor, McKay Coppins, staff writer at The Atlantic. He has a new piece, What Europe Fears. We're going to talk about his most recent book, Romney, A Reckoning. It's a biography of Mitt Romney. We're going to do some Mitt Romney psychoanalysis at the very end, so you're not going to want to miss that. What has happened to McKay?
Hey, Tim. I miss exchanging terse, annoyed emails with each other on the campaign trail. Yeah, those are better days, simpler times.
They were simpler times. And I was kind of a dick as a comm staffer, I will say.
We both were. I was a young BuzzFeed reporter trying to, come up.
I'm over here going, hey, my candidate, John Huntsman, we're in last place. Will you get off my ass? We're in last place, McKay. Will you write a hit piece on somebody else, please? Anyway, let's discuss some more serious matters, alas. I think this was a great pitch. I don't know how you got this through Jeffrey Goldberg, but you got to spend the spring in Europe. Belgium, Poland, Estonia, France, Germany, maybe I'm forgetting one, and you discovered an undercurrent of dread about our upcoming elections. A NATO official said that we are in a precarious place because of the upcoming elections. So talk about the palpable concern of Trump 2.0 at the top level from your travels across Europe.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting because the two things that stood out to me traveling through Europe, talking to all these, officials, diplomats, was that they're following our presidential election incredibly closely.
I did love this anecdote.
Like to the point where they could cite like granular polling data and
Have you seen the new Susquehanna numbers out of Pennsylvania?
Like I felt like I was like trapped at the worst bar in DC. But I mean, honestly, so that was surprising to me. And then the other thing that was surprising is that almost everyone was convinced that Trump was going to win. Like in Germany and Poland, they didn't want to believe it because the prospect terrifies them, but they all believed Trump was going to win. And that was kind of shaping their calculus in terms of how they view the transatlantic alliance, right? Like what I heard again and again was, Europe made it through the first Trump term barely, right? The transatlantic relationship took real damage. But, we survived, and the Biden administration has been kind of restabilizing relationships. But if Trump were to return in this context, with Russia waging war in Ukraine, with Trump saying that, he's ready to abandon NATO countries that don't pay enough for collective defense, like that could actually be the end of the relationship. And it was pretty stark.
Yeah. Let's put a little meat on the bones there, because I know at least some percentage of our listeners will be of the former Republican variety. That's like, okay, the French never liked the Republicans. Okay. There was never a lot of excitement in Europe whenever a Republican got elected. Right. So let's talk about the category difference between just general, European, distaste with the more rugged individualist America and like the tangible fears that they have about a Trump 2.0.
Yeah, I think it's an important point, because there is kind of a free-floating contempt for America that you can find in some urban capitals across Europe, especially among young people.
Western Europe in particular, yeah.
Yes, but I'd make this point. So I spent a lot of time in Warsaw, in Poland, where Poland is actually pretty different from some of those Western European countries. Like its relationship with the U.S. is different. Its history is different. Polls actually show Poland is the most consistently pro-America country in Europe. And it's one of the few countries where attitudes toward the U.S. don't change that much depending on who's in the White House. In Warsaw, I heard repeatedly praise for Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. Like those guys are heroes in Poland because they won the Cold War. They tore down the Iron Curtain. Like that is how America is perceived there. But it was interesting talking to young people in Poland, especially, who grew up with this really idealistic notion about America as a city on a hill and a defender of democracy and, the aspirational country that they wanted to follow. And the Trump era has kind of punctured that image of the U.S., right? And it's not because he's a Republican, and it's not because he's right wing. There are a lot of conservatives in Poland. It's that his kind of hostility toward democratic values and the transatlantic alliance that they always took for granted as being kind of a bipartisan bedrock of American foreign policy has caused them to really question what's going on in the United States, right? Like, Poland is coming out of its own kind of period of domestic political turmoil. The right-wing Law and Justice Party was in power for 8 years, and they were defeated by a cross-partisan coalition that ranged from center-left to center-right. And a lot of people are kind of idealistically engaged in rebuilding democracy in Poland right now. And I spoke to one young woman who was working on that project. She works in the government. She's a grad student. And I asked her, which countries are you looking to as an example as you're trying to rebuild your country? And she mentioned like Estonia and Finland. And she was like, maybe there's something about the maturity of French democracy. And I was like, what about America? And she kind of hesitated and said, I don't know if most people my age would look at America as an ideal way to build a democratic society. And what hurt about it was that she doesn't have that contempt for America. She almost seemed apologetic when she was saying it. Like she felt like bad that she felt this way.
Is this the same young woman that you quoted saying, "What the fuck is happening in the United States?"
and then immediately kind of was startled by her outburst and apologized, But that is how a lot of people feel watching American politics right now.
I feel like she should be like the Bulwark mascot, like, I love the United States. Like, what happened to the Cold War United States? What's going on? What the fuck is happening over there?
She really is. You guys should start translating your articles into Polish and sending them to her. She's probably a big fan.
Okay, we're gonna work on that. I will say we should give credit. The Estonians do have a great young democracy. We have Tuomas Ilves, former president, was is a Bulwark man. Jeb went and visited with him. They've got some great stuff in Estonia, and they're at risk. You talked about it was in Estonia, right, where you went to the actual border with Russia. Talk about that.
Yeah, so I went to the city of Narva, which is right on the border of Russia, separated just by a river and one kind of very heavily guarded road bridge. And I spent some time with this guy who works at the border checkpoint. And he talked about how Narva is in this unique situation because most of the population is ethnically Russian. A lot of security experts believe that if Russia was to provoke NATO, it might be there. They call it the Narva scenario because Putin could kind of follow the same playbook he used in Crimea, using Russian separatists in Narva to kind of seed division and unrest, and using that as a pretense to come into Estonia. But
let's just pause there real quick before you go in there. So the Narva scenario is essentially the theory of the case here among NATO folks is it's right on the Russian border. You're about to talk about this bridge you go over. They cross over the bridge, try to occupy it. There are some Russian speakers there, and then it's almost like a dare to NATO.
Yeah,
it's like, exactly. Are you really going to go to war with us over Narva? That's
exactly right. First of all, there are a lot of people in Narva who are sympathetic to Russia, who are consuming Russian media. They're in the kind of Russian propaganda bubble. And so, Putin would be able to find allies there. But yeah, that would be the calculus, right? Like, we've heard people like Tucker Carlson actually say, like, I'm not sending my kids to die for Estonia, and so like that, the dare would be, are you going to defend this tiny Estonian city or watch the credibility of your vaunted alliance collapse, right? And what was kind of affecting for me was going out to that bridge. I asked this border guard, like, can you take me as close to the border as I can go? And so we walked out to the border, and his Russian counterpart on the other side kind of came out and was like suspiciously sizing us up from the other side of the border. And you just feel the vulnerability there. Like, this is a tiny country the size of Vermont. They rely completely on NATO and really America's support for NATO for their sovereignty and security. And, for a guy like this, who's just kind of like standing at the border, hoping that Russia doesn't ever send tanks across the bridge, like, the stakes are real. This isn't like an abstract debate. The stakes are very real and kind of alarming given the current political context.
Yeah, that was affecting for me as well. And I didn't, get to stand on the bridge with you. I want to talk about the long-term shift in the alliance. It's kind of already happening no matter what happens in the election. I believe it was a French official you quoted that said, we can't just flip a coin and hope Michigan voters vote the right direction every 4 years, as a way of talking about how, Europe's got to think more about how Europe defends itself, if the United States is going to be unreliable. So kind of talk about those conversations and maybe a shift that's already occurring just because of the specter of Trump.
Yeah, it's pretty common these days to hear from European officials who think that Europe needs to develop its own strategic autonomy or defense autonomy. Basically, that with American support, no longer seen as kind of an unwavering thing they can count on, Europe needs to figure out how it can defend itself. And so there are a bunch of different proposals, right? There's like, maybe the European Union should build its own army, or maybe it should divert resources from NATO to the European Defense Alliance. But like, the problem is that with almost everyone who started to go down this road with me, when you really press them on the specifics and the timeline, the idea kind of collapses, right. Like Wolfgang Ischinger, who's the former German ambassador to the US and kind of an elder statesman in German foreign policy, he said basically, look, European autonomy is a great idea for 50 years from now, but it's going to take a long time to get to the point where Europe can replace everything that America provides, right? The nuclear umbrella, the ballistic air defense, like the intelligence gathering. And the problem is that right now the situation is so fraught that they need America more than ever. So it's not. This really isn't that realistic to just even if every European country quadrupled their defense spending, it would still take many, many years before they could rely on themselves to defend themselves without the U.S.
The other thing on all this is, as they're looking at it, you just consider how fraught it is, the weight of it, of the threat. I'm just thinking about Trump's been putting these videos out about Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal reporter, where like it basically seems like Trump is holding him hostage at this point. I honestly, he's like, look, this guy's never going to get out as long as Biden's president, and if I get to become president, then Putin will release him in the next few days. What
gets me about that, by the way, is how specific the timing is.
Yeah.
He's like, it'll be before I take office, but after I win. Like, something a little suspicious about how specific the timing is for when Gershkovich is going to be released, supposedly. Like, but yeah, no.
So they're backchecking. So if you're the Europeans, you're sitting there, you're going, okay, is this just bullshit bluster from a snake oil salesman? Maybe. Is there a back channel with Putin? Maybe. Is this just an informed guess by Donald Trump that Russia wants him to win and will help him, and you figure that Donald Trump will do whatever Russia wants? Maybe, right? But like, all of those doors are terrible if you're Europe, given what we've seen from Russia the last few years, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a good point, because like, this is, I was talking to actually a Republican strategist recently who was saying that the way you have to think about this election is, in investment terms, you call it protecting your downside, right? Yeah. Like, you might not like either option, but you have to game out the worst case scenario for either person getting another term. And like with Biden, if you're a Republican, you're conservative, there are a lot of bad things, right? This is the strategist talking. There are a lot of things that you might not like. But with Trump, the potential downside is so like potentially catastrophic and unknowable that has to factor into decision making. And I think with Europe, that's part of the thinking here, right? Like I report about on how the German foreign ministry is making contingency plans for the outcome of the American election. Yeah. And like their planning for Trump is basically to come up with a list of important issue sets that will be completely destabilized by Trump being reelected, from Ukraine to NATO to climate change to tariffs, and then figuring out how to respond. And, you know, like the problem is that just nobody knows. Like you said, every option is kind of bad if you're one of these European elected officials or diplomats, and there's not a lot of kind of solace being offered by the American government at this point.
I take it that Republican strategist you were talking to was not a Nikki Haley advisor.
I can confirm it was not a Nikki Haley advisor.
Based on her behavior. Okay. All right. You had a kind of one story within the story. It's almost like you should have been two stories, I wonder. Because like we're about halfway through the story. It's like, hey, let's take a little detour down Rick Grenell Avenue here and do a mini profile on this insane person. I think listeners of the podcast are familiar with Rick Grenell, but if you're not, he's the gay MAGA strategist that ended up being a temporary head of DNI under Trump. Has had many screaming matches with me over the years. I was reminded of the scene. So this part of the story, you're interviewing various German officials, and I was reminded of the scene in Mean Girls where Tina Fey asks the school assembly to please raise their hand if they've ever been personally victimized by Regina George, and everybody stands up in the auditorium. It kind of felt like that in your conversations, where everybody was like, "This fucking guy."
Yeah, I mean, it was honestly got to the point where it was funny to me, not to them. Yeah. But like every time I would even just mention Rick Grenell's name in an interview with a German official, they would like sigh heavily and or there would be like mirthless chuckles or like frozen stares into the middle distance. It was honestly, I write that it was like they were processing unresolved trauma or something. Like this is 4 years later and everybody still just like can't believe what his ambassadorship was like, you know? I do think though that the reason that I put it in there, and I you're not wrong that it is basically like a story within a story, but like I felt like it was such a perfect microcosm for kind of Trump's quote unquote America first elbow throwing and what his style of diplomacy does to U.S. relationships. Because the reality of Grenell, and I talked to some of his defenders too, is that like he did get some short-term policy concessions in Germany, right? Like his kind of belligerent bullying style did,
people respond to that,
some results, right? But it came at a cost that, I think you could argue is much more serious than any of the short-term policy concessions, which is like by the end of that ambassadorship, a lot of Germans were openly grappling with their relationship with the U.S., right? Like even when Germany, and again, I want to make this point again, like the Germans have often been critical of America. It's not like this has been a perfect friendship for decades, right? Like certainly during the George W. Bush administration, there was a lot of tension between Western Europe and the U.S., but they always assumed that on the core questions, the U.S. was unshakable, right? On the transatlantic alliance, on commitment to democratic values, on kind of resistance to autocrats, on that stuff. You could trust America regardless of who was in the White House. Yeah, certainly. And now they just have no idea. Like the way that they're now thinking about the U.S. is as kind of another ruthlessly, transactional superpower like China or Russia, right? And like that doesn't mean that all of our European allies are going to, jump ship as soon as Trump is back in the White House, but there are trickle-down effects to thinking about the U.S. that way. If Europe starts to think about America as like, basically similar to another kind of autocratic foreign power. Whether or not
this was the quote. I thought this was the best quote in the piece, where it was like somebody, I forget who it was, compared Grenell to being like a representative from a hostile power.
Yeah,
like
exactly.
In the country, right? And like it's like you treat them differently. I mean, like, right? How the Chinese ambassador is going to get treated differently.
You treat them differently. You take their kind of edicts differently. Yeah. The way that they think about the U.S., they plan for the U.S., like it's just different than if you assume that there is kind of a special relationship that's based on something deeper than just like economic transactionalism.
Yeah.
Right?
All right, let's do a little Mitt. Let's close with a little Mitt talk.
Right.
It's only like in Mitt's fan blog, Mitt's fan podcast over here. We have the fans. The fans had there's a little unrest recently.
I'm sure
on the Mitt fan podcast. It's like when. I'm listening to my Nuggets podcast and the coach isn't putting in the favorite player that everybody likes. It's like, what are you doing, Malone? What are you doing, Mitt? So anyway, we haven't been thrilled about his comments about the Bragg case. You sent out a post. You're kind of just trying to contextualize Mitt's view on Bragg and why he's been more negative towards the conviction than one might have thought. Maybe I'll just kind of let you explain what you think his perspective is on it.
Yeah, I mean, I should say up front, like, I think sometimes people assume that I'm like a spokesman for Mitt Romney. Or I should be called upon to like, I don't feel like I have to defend everything he says, and I don't agree with everything he does. He doesn't agree with me. I do think I can offer some perspective on where he's coming from just based on having spoken to him so much. I'll tell you, I guess, two things. First is that I actually spoke to him like a day or two after Trump's arraignment in Manhattan last year. Yeah. And I remember even then Romney was pretty skeptical of this case. He's not skeptical in general of the criminal charges. He was like the Georgia case he was keeping an eye on, and certainly the Justice Department case, like that stuff he was open to and wanted to like learn more about. But part of the thing with Mitt Romney, and I think this is kind of the plague of the thoroughgoing institutionalist, never Trump Republican in this era, is that like a lot of what alarms him about Trump is his obliteration of democratic precedents and norms. Sure. And I think that like Romney gets queasy when he feels like the opposition to Trump is doing unprecedented things like indicting or convicting a former president. Yeah. Now, that said, I think the other thing at play here, and maybe even more influential on some of the comments he's made, he gave me that statement criticizing Bragg. He also, I think a couple of weeks ago in an interview on MSNBC said that if he were Biden, he would have, he said he would have, if he were Biden, he would have pardoned Trump. And that made a lot of people angry. But like,
that was not received well on the fan podcast.
The fan podcast didn't take that one well.
No.
I mean, But I think the missing context here is that he's not like he's not concerned for Trump's like legal well-being. The main thing that Romney cares about when it comes to Trump is that he not get back to the White House. Yeah. And in his mind, this criminal process specifically is more likely to help him than hurt him. And he thinks that Democrats could have handled it better in a way that would have allowed, Trump to actually be politically damaged by all this. He said to me that in that statement that like Bragg should have tried to settle or come up with some kind of plea deal. Yeah. I think he must know that Trump never would have taken a plea deal, right. But the idea would have been like, if Trump refused to deal, then Bragg could have said, well, he forced my hand and right. Like now we have to, convict him. So, I don't know that he's right about the politics, but I think that's where he's coming from. He's trying to figure out how the Democrats can use this to their advantage to beat Trump, not like how he's not worried about like Trump being treated unfairly.
Yeah, a big part of, I think, my frustration with it is he kind of buys into this notion that this is like part of some Democratic strategy, when it's kind of like, if the Democrats were in charge of this would definitely not have been the case that landed.
That started,
right?
right,
it just kind of happened like this way, and it's just the nature of the system. Anyway, JVL gives a much more thorough rebuke, a refutation, if you will, to that on the triad. If you're not doing that, you can sign up for the triad on the Bulwark.com. I do want to ask you one last thing about Mitt, though. You said there somewhere in there something along the lines of that his main concern is that Trump not get back in the White House again. There is one thing he could do that would help with that, conceivably, on the margins, and that would be support his opponent, maybe even speak on behalf of his opponent. Coming up here, there's going to be a couple big opportunities to do that this summer. Doesn't seem like he's on that trajectory. How do you think he's thinking about that?
Yeah, this is where I'm going to fully shift into like pundit speculation.
Mode. Yeah.
not based on.
This is you've read the man's diaries. I'm not asking to be a spokesman. You've read the man's diaries. I'm wondering how you think he thinks about whether he can fully, jump both feet in and do. I'm trying to think whoever, nobody, like Meg Whitman or whatever, whoever spoke at the last Biden convention, or
I'll give some context here. He likes Joe Biden. They have a relationship. I write about this in the book. On a personal level, they actually get along really well. He respects Biden as a person. He thinks he's a good guy. And he thinks that he's generally well-intentioned. His policies drive Mitt crazy. And I think that's a big thing that's keeping him from, going all in. But I will also say, I feel like there's an assumption that because he hasn't endorsed Biden, like there's no possibility that he will do it. Like, I actually don't know. I think that the door is more, my speculative but educated guess is that the door is more open to that than people might think. Like he hasn't, he certainly will never endorse Trump. He's not going to vote for Trump. And I could see him at some point deciding that he does want to do it. I don't know, but I think if it happened, it would probably be later in the year. I doubt he'll, like you said, speak at the Democratic convention. But, you could see all kinds of surprise Republican endorsements in like October of this year. And will Romney's name be among them? I don't know, but I wouldn't rule it out necessarily.
I think like a flaw of the Mitt type people, a lot of people in this world that I speak to, obviously, they call me, what should I do? What do you think? Is like, I don't want to endorse the whole Democratic platform. I'm not a Democrat. I don't like a lot of things he did. And I say to anybody, to Mitt, if he's listening, to anyone else that is like thinking about doing this, like it's actually more powerful for people. Like to say, it would be more powerful politically for Mitt to say, I actually think Joe Biden fucked up A, B, C, D, E, and F, and I still am going to vote for him. You know what I mean? And I do think sometimes there's this feeling that's like, oh, if I endorse, because historically that is how it's been. If like you endorse somebody, it's because like you basically agree with them on stuff, and so it's hard.
Or you have to pretend to agree.
Or you have to pretend to, but it's like it's hard to get your mind in this place where like, no, I can endorse them, and actually, also it might help for me to say no. I think that he's wrong on a bunch of things. So anyway, I don't know if that'll happen. Pierre, if you're out there, that'd be my advice to you. But, since when did anybody listen to my advice? It's been a while. And as we discussed at the beginning of this interview, it didn't turn out that well to the last couple guys that did listen to my advice. So, take it with a grain of salt. McKay, any final thoughts of words of wisdom for everybody?
No, go subscribe to The Atlantic and read all my colleagues' great work. It's going to be a very busy few months here.
100% endorse that. McKay Coppins, thank you so much for being on the Bulwark Podcast. Come back again soon. Everybody else will be back tomorrow with your pal, Adam Kinzinger. See y'all then. Peace.